Hello there. My name is Jay Stong, and this is my presentation on civil liberties and civil rights. So I'm going to go through 9 different civil liberties and civil rights and give some common misconceptions about them and maybe some truths about them that aren't widely known to the general public today. So first of all, we have this civil liberty, which is freedom of the religion, which is the idea that individuals have the right to practice their religion or their faith, or not practice any religion at all. Um, and one common misconception is that free exercise equals free practice of anything. So you can do whatever you want. But that's not always the case. For example, the government has the ability to ban certain practices, like they're not going to let um, someone sacrifice a child to an ancient Aztec god, but they will allow someone to to hold that belief. So it's free exercise of religion still can bar certain practices. Another misconception is that the two clauses, the establishment clause and the free exercise clause, are interchangeable. Um, but in fact, there have been cases such as the school prayer case that pit those clauses against each other, um, because there is that play of allowing people to individually practice, but also um, having the state separate from the church. Secondly, we have freedom of speech, which is the freedom to express ideas and opinions without being censored by the state. And one of the misconceptions is that only spoken words are protected, but in fact, free speech includes symbols and icons that maybe aren't written words, but those are still protected. Another misconception is that anything goes as far as free speech, like you can literally say anything. But in fact, there is a category called fighting words, which are not protected. And fighting words basically are just words that incite violence. They're not meant to share an opinion or a belief. They're meant to basically just incite violence. Next is freedom of the press, which is the freedom of media um, to circulate information and freely criticize the government, being a check of power. Um, some of the common misconceptions are that only mainstream press is protected. That's not the case. Even um, offensive publications or fringe publications that are out of the public mainstream are protected. Another misconception is that the government can censor content. I think there's a lot of fear mongering going around that certain things are censored. But in fact, prior restraint of publications, that's something that rarely happens. We rarely see that. Next is search and seizure, which is that government authorities must have probable cause and a warrant, well, usually a warrant, to seize evidence and to seize property from suspects. And one of the misconceptions is that students have equal rights with adults. I mean, in a sense, they do, but schools only need reasonable suspicion for search and seizure. So in that sense, they have less protection. And another misconception is that a warrant is always required. A warrant is not always required. Sometimes it's replaced by just reasonableness standards, and that doesn't always look like a warrant. And then there's due process, which is the principle that the government needs to follow legal procedures, consistently fair legal procedures before depriving anyone of property, of life, of liberty. Um, and the first misconception is that due process is only for the criminal defendant, when in fact due process actually applies to family law, contracts, and property rights. So many different types of processes. Another misconception is that due process is all about just having a fair procedure, but it's also about just protecting fundamental rights, um, such as privacy and marriage. Next, we have the Ninth Amendment, um, which basically states that rights not explicitly listed by the Constitution still apply for the people. Um, and that's one of the misconceptions, that a right has to be listed for it to apply. But this amendment is saying that rights not listed, such as privacy, for example, are still recognized. And another misconception is that the Ninth Amendment is irrelevant, that it can't be evoked when it comes to court cases. The truth is, it is still very relevant, and it's a basis for arguments about autonomy, personal choice, and privacy, as I mentioned before. The 10th Amendment is basically states that powers not delegated to the federal government are reserved for the states or the people. One misconception is that the federal government can act in all areas, but in fact, everything that is not delegated to the federal government actually defaults back to the states. So there is this balance of power between the nation, but also individual states. And another misconception is that the 10th Amendment is merely symbolic, that the states don't actually have any real power. But the truth is, it has been used in Federalist debates and evoked in cases such as the Pritz v. United States, which was a case dealing with the federal government trying to mandate what sheriffs were doing in the states, which in fact was unconstitutional as far as this amendment goes. And then equal protection. Equal protection is that all individuals must be treated equally under the law without unjust discrimination. Misconception is that equal protection only covers racial minorities, but it also covers gender, discrimination, disabilities. And there's another misconception that all groups get scrutiny. But there is a hierarchy of scrutiny that levels, with most scrutiny being for race, and then going down to gender, and then other classifications such as age. And then finally, discrimination. Unfair treatment of an individual based on their racial profile, based on their gender, or what religion they follow. And a misconception is that all workplace bias is treated as the same, but there are different types, like disparate impact involves just when a policy has an unequal effect on different parties, while harassment is actually a hostile environment for certain people groups. And then finally, a misconception is that the federal law uniformly protects all people, when in fact, states often have protections that go beyond federal minimums. So it is a state-by-state thing in some cases. Thank you for watching. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.